Welcome, one and all. Come, sit yourself down by the fire with a warm cup of cocoa. I'm here to read you a story of greed, poverty, death, despair, and Christmas. Doesn't that sound nice? It's all very Dickensian. Once upon a time in London, in the 1830s, a man by the name of Charles John Huffam Dickens picked up a pen and wrote a lot of stories. He'd continue writing up until his death in 1870. Very few writers have become adjectives. The writing style is so iconic and distinct, it becomes a qualifier. The few I can think of include Shakespearean, Kafkaesque, and Dickensian. But what does Dickensian really mean? Well, I listed a few nouns at the start of this video, things like poverty, despair, and Christmas, which is what I'm using to cling to this video being a festive one. I think one piece of media which best encaptures the essence of Dickens' work outside of his books, obviously, is the BBC television series Dickensian. If you're one of the 10 people who've been watching this channel since the start, you may be thinking, didn't he already make a video about this show? Yes, I did. And it was not good, and the sound was off, and so it's gone forever. But now the holidays have rolled around once more, and the other video I was planning was about the world ending, so we're saving that for New Year's. Dickensian follows many characters from Dickens' novels, mostly before and sometimes slightly during the stories people are familiar with. He uses characters from Bleak House, Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, and many more. In the show, I think the use of characters and settings are handled masterfully. The way they liberated themselves from plots by making it generally a prequel or prequels to the many stories, it shows a setup for many of the tales people are familiar with, but allowing for narrative freedom within the show while still having a visible goal for most of the characters. If you know the stories or have read the books, you know that Marley's going to die, you know Tiny Tim will get a crutch, you know Oliver Twist will say,
"Please, sir, I want some more."
And you know the situation with the Havishams will end quite badly. But even if you haven't read the books or don't know the stories, the show is still very enjoyable. You don't actually require the prior knowledge, you can just be surprised as to where the plot goes. So what happens in the show? How does it reflect Dickens? Marley was dead to begin with, but not really. Marley, as in Jacob Marley, the Marley who haunts Scrooge, and whose character is made much worse in the show than it ever was described in the books, is killed on Christmas Eve. This is the end of the first episode of Dickensian, and spurs the main through line of the show. It's the mystery which weaves all the disparate plots together. The setting also plays a vital role in the show. Dickensian is an adjective that could be used to describe it. But what's a Dickensian setting? Well, the streets of London, covered in snow sometimes, in the 1830s and 40s. The buildings lean into each other. The whole show takes place in a few streets in London. Is this for budget reasons? Probably. But it also allows for all of the characters' lives to feel very connected. They all have a neighborhood pub that they meet up in. They all owe money to the same lenders. The way in which characters traverse these streets is also good at establishing who they are and their position in society. Because in this time and place, which is captured in almost all Dickens novels, class is very important to the story. The wealthiest, such as Amelia Havisham, go about in a carriage, while the poorest, such as little Oliver Twist, skulks in the corners, ignored by passerbys. Money plays a role in nearly everyone's stories. The Havishams dispute over who will control the family business. Many characters owe money to Scrooge and Marley, which is why so many people are suspected of the latter's death. Money ruled over Dickens' life. It's well documented that he spent a time in his childhood in debtor's prison because of his father, as well as worked in a factory as a youth. Money and by extension class were driving forces of this era, and are thus reflected in Dickens' works, and therefore Dickensian. Dickens wrote about the common people as well as the wealthy. He wrote to reflect a broader view of life than many of his contemporaries who were members themselves of the upper class, therefore much of their work centered the wealthy as well. Despite the misery which is shown throughout the show and Dickens' stories, there is a lot of hope as well. Dickensian allows for there to be reprieves, even if a lot of people's stories don't end happily. But for many of them, Dickensian isn't the end of their story. It's simply time for another Christmas. But why is Dickens so deeply associated with Christmas? So much so that the television show opens and closes on Christmas Eve. The streets of London covered in snow is a constant visual throughout the whole thing. Well, obviously A Christmas Carol is Dickens' most known work. It's certainly the most adapted, sometimes poorly and sometimes into cinematic masterpieces. Dickens actually wrote 5 Christmas-themed books on top of A Christmas Carol. He also wrote The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man, and The Ghost's Bargain. But none of those are in the TV show. I think Christmas kept finding a way into Dickens' stories because of how much the holiday is reflective of the values and themes he liked writing about. Christmas is a dichotomy. It's supposed to be a time of togetherness and joy, but it's also a time where the haves and have-nots are the most divided, where how little you can afford becomes the most apparent, while you watch the wealthy throw lavish parties and feasts. But also, Dickens has been credited with inventing Christmas. There's even a movie starring Dan Stevens about him called The Man Who Invented Christmas. But that's not fully true. Although the things I just said that Christmas were about, those were probably brought to popularity, or at least renewed popularity, through the extreme prevalence and popularity of A Christmas Carol, which brought about a renewed life and interest into the holiday. According to Mark Connolly, a history professor at the University of Kent, at the time of A Christmas Carol's writing, the days-long feasting and merriment that made up medieval Christmas celebrations had quelled quite considerably. But there had been an uptick of historical nonfiction writing about the holiday in recent years, such as T.K. Hervey's A History of the Christmas Festival, the New Year, and Their Peculiar Customs, which was written in 1843. This led to a renewed widespread interest, mostly among the middle class, in the early 19th century, and a desire to reinvigorate Christmas's ancient customs. This was a desire which Dickens reflected in his work, and which was thus reflected back tenfold in society in the years, decades to come. I've realized I ended up not talking about the Dickensian show as much as a video named after it should be, but I will do that a bit more right now. I highly recommend you check out the show. It's melodramatic, but very well acted, which makes up for that. The costumes are beautiful and, for the most part, quite historically accurate, and it does a good job of bringing all of these characters to life, including humanizing and giving character development that isn't present in some of the books to some characters like Fagin, who, while no means is a good person in the show, is much less of a kind of offensive stereotype than he is in the books. It makes sense in this world of the show that they all interact in. All the characters of Dickens' stories slot so well together to create a roster of characters who all seamlessly exist in the same setting and stories together. This works because of the settings and themes of his stories overlap so often. So, after all that, what does Dickensian truly mean? According to literary scholar V.H. Alamandy in 1922, Dickens, it may truly be said, is Christmas. But he's a lot more than that. As much as I love A Christmas Carol, there's a reason Dickensian wasn't just about Scrooge and the Cratchits. There's a plethora of Dickens stories that have nothing to do with the holiday, even if it is so ingrained in him as a writer and historical figure. So does Dickensian mean orphans huddled against the cold? Does it mean the misery of being poor, the misery of money, and the pressures it puts on everyone? Does it mean hope, despite all that? That you can live up to your great expectations, but more importantly, you shouldn't have those expectations put on you in the first place? Does it mean love and doing what you can despite all you've done and the hurt you've caused? That a miserly old man can change his heart and learn to give?
Just this year, obviously, there's no point going mad.
That's not what the show is about. Dickensian doesn't have happy endings all around, because Dickens' novels start when the characters are down, so that they may rise and grow. Dickensian sets the scene of tragedy, of misery during a time that's supposed to be merry, and also of potential for betterment. There's always a little bit of hope, despite the bleakness. The song that's playing right now is one of the songs from the show's score, composed and conducted by Debbie Wiseman, and it's called A Long Road Without Return. That's Dickensian. A long road, a hard road, a road without turns, covered in snow, but a road you walk nonetheless. And we know how the stories end eventually. We know Compeyson will eventually pay for his crimes, and Scrooge will be visited by 3 ghosts and become a good man. The ends are there for anyone to read in the books. The holidays can be a hard time for a lot of people, especially with all that's going on in the world right now. But we should never lose what hope we have, and we find that in those around us. I think if there's anything we can take away from Dickensian, is that the story keeps going. And if we actually all try to care a little bit more, the next chapter will hopefully be better than the last one. Happy holidays, everyone. Stay safe out there. Have a good one.